So back in 2007, the George Washington Foundation uncovered a carnelian bead. It's tubular in shape, and for those unfamiliar with carnelian, it's a semi-precious stone, which in its finished form can be anywhere in orange to red coloration. The stone itself can be found throughout the world, but this particular piece is sourced in India. And India is known for its production of carnelian jewelry and carnelian beads, dating back to pre-Indus Valley times. When it was uncovered, there had been very little research done on these beads, mainly just one archaeologist who had uncovered two in an enslaved cemetery in Barbados at Newtown Plantation. And that formed basically the foundation of our research and what we went off of. And so we knew from cultural studies that they were popular in West Africa during the 18th century. They were prestige items, marking someone as a member of having high status, being a leader in their community, be it political, spiritual, or both. And then evidently some had made it over here through the Middle Passage. Recently, however, we've continued our research on that, and we've uncovered a new tract that might explain their presence and their uses.
So what do you think they are?
So the original interpretation still stands. They very much were a prestige item in West Africa, but also Madagascar. They had been traded to those parts of Africa from connections to India, and then evidently made the Middle Passage to the Americas and remained within the enslaved black community. However, looking at some historical research done on the slave trade, it turns out that under another name, a term orango or rengo, these beads were actually being traded into West Africa and Madagascar by Europeans, particularly the East India Company and independent slave traders and merchants, to further the Atlantic slave trade. They were being used to break into the economy. They registered what goods were in demand in Africa, and so they then sought to provide them, and this was done in exchange for captives. And at the time when I started this project, because we just started looking over the bead about a year and a half ago again, revisiting it, there were the two in Barbados, as previously mentioned, and one in Annapolis. But from searching online to see which other sites had reported beads, and then predominantly cold calling sites in our region, but then also elsewhere on the East Coast, I started with 3 other beads, and I'm now up to 42 or something about that, and the number keeps climbing as I'm reaching out to people. It's a great artifact that while we just have the one, it's still extremely rare, though evidently not as rare as originally thought. It's a great way of showing how interconnected the world was. We like to think that in the past, the world wasn't that global. Yeah. And while, yes, things took longer than they do now, the world has been interconnected since its earliest days through networks of exchange and trade. And the bead really illustrates that. But also how all these different cultural groups interacted with each other, but saw the same piece of material culture through a different lens. For India, carnelian that was being exported was simply a trade good to be made for profit. In Africa, they were prestige items. They were part of the culture, a very significant portion. For Europeans, it was again a tool. It was a trade piece, but it was a tool to enter into an economy that they wanted to take advantage of and then seek to further the Atlantic slave trade. And with the original interpretation that the original owner somehow kept the bead on them through the Middle Passage, that's still very much a possibility.
Yeah.
You cannot discount human ingenuity and human resilience in terms of keeping an item that's of such importance to them. But it's also quite possible that as these beads were on the ships as trade goods, that they were picked up by captives who were forcibly transported, or that they were given out by enslavers on the ships. There's a very disturbing practice almost. You see that the enslavers didn't understand why, but they registered that if they gave beads to captives, they almost served as pacifiers. And so it's quite possible that these leftover trade items were given out throughout the journey. And so the people who arrived with the beads here in the Americas were not the original owners, but they certainly understood the significance that these beads held in their culture back home. A lot of these beads have been turning up near kitchens, which is a thread I certainly want to explore further. The beads, when you look at their mythological origin in India, they have a connection to fire. They're fire treated to pull out the color, and then they're being found near places of fire here. So there's that fun little connection. But going with that, in enslaved communities, the cook holds a very significant role because they kind of tread the line between the enslaved and then the enslaver communities on the plantation. And they can provide so much insight, but then also resources to their fellow members of the enslaved community. So the cook really held a very important role on plantations traditionally, almost in a way you could say mimicking the traditional leaders you had in West Africa. So it's a question there with the beads cropping up near kitchens. Is it potential indication of ownership, that the people wearing these beads were cooks, and in doing so that was some form of continuation or evolution of West African culture as part of the greater African diaspora? Or is it simply a coincidence? We always like to see some kind of connection and basically hang on to it and really drive a point home. But just as a piece might be significant because it's a reminder of where you came from and the culture, it could also be that an item was significant because it belonged to your mother and it has nothing to do with West African culture per se anymore. We simply don't know. But it's definitely a route to explore further, see where more of these beads are cropping up, see if we can get some oral histories from descendant communities who might be able to shed more light on these beads. Archaeologists here in North America have explored them very little. Historians of the slave trade have connected them to that, but not continued it to North America. They've simply studied them as the role of a trade good. And then people who study African culture have discussed them there, but this is really the first time that we're connecting all of these studies. And so there's certainly areas that need to be expanded and gaps that need to be filled. And that's a place where individuals in descendant communities who have direct ties to these beads and their history will be able to shed far more light on them than historians and archaeologists who are coming from an outsider's perspective. We're constantly writing our story and revising it. We just don't know what each excavation will bring and what more it will seek to tell us about the Washingtons, the enslaved community here, the Civil War encampment, and all the other people that have lived here, because we have our oldest artifact is at 14,000 years old. So that is our minimum for how long people have been living on and using this landscape. So 14,000 years is a lot of time to cover, with the majority of that time being occupied by indigenous peoples. And for those wishing to see the bead, it's actually currently on display in our gallery in an exhibit on the enslaved community here at Ferry Farm. You'll see it sitting by itself as just this tubular orange bead. We do our best to get our artifacts on display so that people can feel that connection. They can see them in person and understand a bit more, because everyone loves documents. They provide a wealth of information, and they're really cool to see everyone's handwriting. But the tangible items, the actual material culture, is what we find people most relate to.